Good morning, David. Good morning to all the listeners out there. Today we have a really interesting guest. I'm excited. I've been going through David's book called Raiders, Rulers, and Traders. It is by far one of the most interesting books I've ever read, to be honest. And maybe that's because of the time and space that I'm in right now. But it is, in my opinion, a must read. So, David Chaffetz, welcome to the show and thank you for being here.
Good morning, Justin, and thank you for that warm introduction. You asked me to say a few things about myself. I try to keep this very brief because, at my age, I could tell you a lot of things. I've spent about 50 years fascinated with Asian history. When I was 20 years old, a friend of mine and I made a horseback trek across Western Afghanistan. I wrote a book about that was published in 1980 called A Journey Through Afghanistan. It's still in print with University of Chicago Print. Afterwards, I had a business career that took me very far away from history and horses, but it did enable me to travel extensively in Asia. So I have visited for professional or for leisure purposes all of the countries that I talk about in the book. And then a few years ago, I retired from full-time employment and I started to go back to my original passion, which was the history of Asia, and in particular, the history of the horse breeding peoples of Asia. And that resulted in this book, which I'm glad you enjoyed.
Yeah, for sure. Amazing. And where are you from originally? I know you split your time between, I think, Lisbon and Paris. Is that correct?
Right, right. I'm from Chicago. I went to school on the East Coast about 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago now. I had an opportunity to move to Europe with my employer, and I never moved back.
All right. Well, it sounds kind of similar for me. I moved to Beijing about 15 days after graduating college and haven't spent too much time in the US ever since. But I think one thing that is really fun about this book for me, and books are like this sometimes, where I remember reading Shantaram, if you've ever read that book.
Sure.
Um, and if you've been in Mumbai, if you've lived in India, it has a different texture to it. You can smell what he's describing, you can see it, you can feel the energy of that city as you go through. And after reading your book, I just, so many places I want to travel to again or go to with this kind of new perception of, even, I mean, I spent a lot of time in Delhi, but had no idea the background of Delhi and the connection to horses and things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just really fun
That
to,
you're making, yeah, Justin, you're making a really good point about being in a place versus studying a place. For example, when I talk about the steppes, most people think of the steppes as desert, and of course, the word desert itself covers a huge amount of different terrains. But I want to remind everybody that uh, once I was traveling on the steppes in Russia in springtime. I went to bed. I arrived at night, and I woke up in the morning, and so I saw it for the first time while I was in the middle of it in the morning, and it was covered with wildflowers as far as the eye could see. So most of us, when we think of the Russian steppe, we think of sort of brown earth with nothing on it, and it's completely different. And so that sort of been there, feel it feeling is what I was trying to convey in part to the book.
yeah, for sure. So I mean, start us off with, I mean, because this is the story. It's an enmeshed story between this other animal, the horse, and the human species, and how it's given rise to some of the largest civilizations. You even, and we can get into this more later, but just as a preface, right? You mentioned how really it could have and maybe should have been called the horse road and not the Silk Road,
Mm-hmm.
as the horse was actually the main, animal, the main commodity being traded, the
Right.
commodity that also allowed you to even travel over those distances to trade other things. I mean, the whole thing is premised on the horse. And so, but you start with the earlier evolution of the horse. So maybe just tell us a little bit about, Is it pronounced the genus or the species is Equus or Equus?
Equid, equid.
Equid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, well, I'm not a biologist, so I get confused also with the Latin nomenclature for these things. But basically, equids are today represented by horses, zebras, and donkeys, and it's a genus that originally evolved in the North America, or let's say the Americas, and went extinct in America. But before its extinction, it traveled in the opposite direction of the human beings. It traveled from North America to Asia, and then it spread throughout Eurasia. So the zebras and the donkeys, to some extent, traveled down into Africa, where the zebra exclusively lives, and the donkey in pretty much historical times originated from. The horse has traveled all over Europe because the horse is an animal which thrives in colder climates. So we're talking about the Ice Age, and as the Ice Age retreated from, let's say, the shores of the Mediterranean further north, all these newly grazable territories were very good places for horses. So horses were uh, numerous in Iberia, in Italy, in France. Uh, and it's about the time that our species began to settle in Europe and to take advantage of the retreat of the ice sheet. And we basically lived maybe 30% of our food came from horses. I mean, we talk about hunting mammoths and stuff like that, but the horses were a lot easier to hunt. And as I say in the book, horse meat was and is very tasty and very nutritious. So it was one of the favored sources of meat, and partly for that reason, the horse turns out to be the most uh, often depicted animal in cave paintings. So if you think about the famous caves in the south of France, like Lascaux, you see 2/3 of the animals are horses because it was a major source of food for our ancestors in Europe.
Wow.
It was such a good source of food that we hunted them to extinction in Europe. And we're pretty sure today that none of today's horses are descended from these ancient European horses. The horses wound up surviving in a pocket of territory where men couldn't go very easily, which is the steppe, because we were on foot and they're
Hoof.
on their forefeet, so they could get away from us. So the steppe became a kind of a reserve for horses after we had hunted them to extinction in those territories where the terrain didn't favor them as much.
And this just a real quick question. This time of like hunting the extinction, we're talking roughly probably what, like 10,000, fifteen
That,
thousand years ago? Like it's
or yeah, 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, exactly.
and this is only Homo sapiens, or is it potentially like Neanderthals as well? Or
That's a good question. I think Neanderthals and Homo sapiens overlapped in Europe, so it's probably the case that the Neanderthals also hunted them. But I don't think the Neanderthals are responsible for those cave paintings that I mentioned. That's our species. Um, and then when we're talking about the horses retreating back to the steppe, the future interaction is purely with Homo sapiens.
right. Okay. Yeah, it was interesting to start off reading the book and just to know that, those original kind of that original, species actually went the opposite way across the land bridge from, I think you mentioned an archaeological find in Idaho, like one of that's like 3 point something million years old, and then they go across all the way from there over to Asia into Europe. And so it was fascinating to see that they went the opposite direction because, we don't associate the horse now with the native horse being with North America. Um, so that was
A lot of people find it hard to believe that the horse is not native to the Americas because it's hard to imagine the Great Plains or the Argentine Pampas without horses. So there is, I would say, a hardcore people who don't like that explanation, but I think most scientific sources would say that the horse was extinct and that the horses were brought back to America around 1500 by the second or third boatload of Spanish explorers who followed
Right.
Columbus.
Right. Okay. And so now we're moving over into this place called the Steppe. And one thing I enjoyed about your book was is it really, and even I'm just realizing I wish I would have paid more attention to maps and places over time. And so I found myself every other day while I'm reading the book getting on Google Maps trying to identify some of these places because the Steppe is an enormously large area. And so kind of give us a little broad overview of the steps so that way that we can then go deeper into kind of the next, I believe the next phase of the evolution of the relationship would be moving from not only meat but then to milk production and
Mm-hmm.
then so forth.
So there may be three ways to think about the steppe. The first is sort of the absence of mountains. If you look at Eurasia from Paris, where I am now, to Beijing, there's almost a continuous band of plains. There's no big barrier to migration or movement. You have mountains, but the mountains are not barrier mountains like the Alps. The Alps, the passes are at 3,000 meters. They're closed for most of the winter. In ancient times, you had to go on very, very narrow goat paths to get from Germany to Italy until modern roads were built. So such barriers do not exist basically between Paris and China. So it's very flat. The second thing is the climate in this area in a narrow band, narrower than what I'm talking about in terms of topography. The climate is not too wet so that you get jungle or massive growth of trees, and not too dry that there's no grass growing. So it is a Goldilocks kind of climate for grass, and horses eat grass, so that's why this is the favored domain for horses. And then the third thing about the steppe is that it doesn't get enough rain to really attract agriculture on a big scale. It does in some years, it does in others. So we always found a certain amount of agricultural settlement mixed in with the horse breeding people or the pastoralist people. But, it's not like the Nile Valley or the land between the Tigris and Euphrates River or the Ganges Valley in India. So it didn't have a really big agricultural population. So that implies a completely different human society on the steppes. So absence of agriculture, adequate grasslands, flat territory, making mobility both possible and necessary. And that's what characterizes the steppes. And in the widest steppes, the steppes, as I say, go from the heart of Europe all the way into China. And in a more narrow sense, with let's say all those conditions applying, the steppes go from the Great Wall in China to just south of Moscow.
Okay, gotcha. And so take us through. So we're, Homo sapiens in the past, 5 to 10,000 years, and we're eating horse meat. We're kind of following them around. And then milk production happens.
Right. So the thing to keep in mind is that we're talking now about 5,000 to about 5,000 years ago. Human beings had domesticated sheep and goats much earlier, about 70,000 years ago. So we were very familiar with the economy based on raising animals, interfering in their reproductive life cycle, and diverting some of their milk production for our own benefit while eating some of their offspring, and then keeping other offspring to raise to continue the cycle of milk producing animals. So there is nothing very revolutionary about adapting to milking horses. It's just a bit harder to do because horses can run much faster than goats and sheep, and it probably took longer for that reason, but the logic was there. So the process I outline in the book is that we started capturing mares and using them as decoys to attract stallions, which we could then hunt and kill. And then we started keeping mares on a more permanent basis with their foals. And then learning that if we kept the foal, the mare wouldn't run away. We could tie the foal, the mare would stay there. Then we could actually milk the mare. And over time, the mare became more used to living among human beings. The next thing that happens is we start selecting mares for milk and for docility, so that over time, the genetic portfolio of that particular herd of horses became more and more accustomed to domestication. And lo and behold, we have another animal to join our herd of domesticated quadrupeds.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you were describing in the book a lot is that, like you just said, is that the logic of domestication was already there, but the horse was probably much more challenging, in terms of behaviorally and just their speed and their ability compared to, sheep and goats and other forms of animals. And so that
the commonality is that a whole lot of animals can be domesticated because they're herd animals, and they identify humans as being part of the herd, either senior members of the herd or junior members of the herd. And that's true for dogs, it's true for cats, it's true for sheep and goats. What we think of as separate species, to some extent, we all have a common sociability. And it's just a matter of time for certain animals to accustom themselves to living in a human community. And over time, through breeding, through selective breeding, we wind up having those animals major in accepting human beings. Now, for various reasons, not all animals can be domesticated. Obviously, no one's done a good job domesticating lions or tigers and zebras, for example. People have tried to domesticate zebras over and over again, and it's just not possible. So I guess of all the mammals in the world, we probably domesticated all the ones that are possible to domesticate: camels, yaks, reindeer, and the remaining animals just don't have that gene don't have that gene pool that would enable us to domesticate them.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. And so where does it go next after this milk domestication? Then it starts to transform again.
Right. Well, so the question that comes up is, how did we manage to keep track of these herds of animals that can run much faster than we can? And so the thought is that riding animals had to come in rather soon, because otherwise you would have a herd of milk producing mares and they would wander off, and it would be really hard to get them back. So we have to assume that the original reason for riding was simply to be able to herd them, unlike sheep and goats, where young kids can keep up with them. So I hypothesize that people started climbing up on horses simply to be able to keep track of where the herd is. And as the herd got bigger and they traveled farther, and I come back to why they have to travel farther, you had to get better at riding. Riding became more real transportation and not just sitting on top of a horse watching the other horses.
Right.
Why did they have to get better at riding? Horses, unlike sheep and goats, graze in a very wide space, because horses are very clean animals. They're very picky about what they eat, and they don't like to graze in the presence of their own poop. So they will go further and further away from where they started grazing, and they graze for 16 to 20 hours a day. So they can cover very big territory in that period of time. And if you're going to be sitting on the bareback on one of these horses, you have to be a pretty good rider. So I think the skill of riding originated from the necessity to herd them over big distances. And in those territories, or let's say in the time of year when grass was scarce and you had to go much further to get grass, the whole community had to become more migrant, because the horses are migrant. The horses would seek out the best grass as the season evolved, either by moving up into a colder area in the mountains or moving down into a warmer area near the rivers, and the whole community would have to go with them. So over time, the horses transformed the humans into what we have today, the nomad pastoralists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the, I think, the fun parts of reading this story is to just see how much it's, the we it's we oftentimes think of like, oh, they were nomadic, and it's kind of like this choice to go here or go there, do this, and like this very basic assumption about just mobility and movement. But when you're reading your book, you see so clearly of like, the whole name of the game is you got to follow the horses, because the horses have to go to new pasture. They
Right.
have to have more and more grass, or access to grass during certain times of year. And you see how, even when you look at, the structure of those nomadic societies in terms of their housing, right? The yurts, and just the mobility of that lifestyle is just completely determined by the fact that you're working with the horse. Like that's the entire I would call, pressure, right? The entire evolutionary pressure is to make sure that everything revolves around this thing that's providing you your sustenance, which is super, super fascinating to see throughout the book, all the different times.
Yeah,
Okay.
just note in passing that the Chinese characterized all those peoples who had this lifestyle. They said these people follow the grass and the water. That was sort of the Chinese catchphrase for anybody who's involved in nomadic pastoralism.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And there's some other really good names that you put in the book. I unfortunately I don't have them in my notes right here, but there's really wonderful characterizations through names of things, showing how important the horse is, right? Whether, even, I think at one point, this is more toward the end, but there's a coin, and I think this was the Russian coin
The
at
Kopek.
some point, the Kopek, right? But it has a horse. But there was even, tell us a little bit about, and we're jumping ahead a little bit, but there's some civilizations or peoples that were named after, there was something about like the politicians or the people in power, like the name for them was like directly related to horse in some way.
Well, I mean, it's similar to American Indians, right? Crazy horse.
Uh-huh. Right.
Both in India and Iran, a lot of personal name, and Greeks too, by the way. Um, the Greeks, Philip, right? Philippus means a lover of horses. Um, Many Iranian names sound. If you translate them into English, it sounds like names from the Native American peoples. So, for example, one of the great Shahs of Iran was Shah Tahmasp, and that means powerful in horses. Or in many India, personal names have the word Asfa in it, which means horse. So it really does sort of dominate the ethos of the warrior aristocrats of those countries.
Hmm. Yeah, like you're saying, it's kind of yeah, I guess you might call them like more indigenous style names or even place names where it's kind of specific to the driving phenomena, right? The place where grass grows at this time is the name for a lot, for
Right.
some
Well,
place or.
also coming to the Chinese, there's a character in the book named General Ma, and he's a sort of a hereditary master of the stables of the emperor, meaning that his ancestors, as far back as anyone can remember, were always responsible for the imperial stables. And Ma, of course, in Chinese means horse.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was a lot of fun reading those parts. So how do we get from, these early days in the steppe to kind of the first large scale, bands and tribes, and then the interactions coming later with these other civilizations?
Right. So there's a huge amount of scholarly debate as to about state formation, which is the kind of academic um, term for what we're talking about here. State formation among the nomads. Um, One school of thought says that the nomads started to raid the settled peoples because they were very competent on horseback and they could hit and run and take kidnap people and get plunder, and that over time they got bigger and bigger because there was safety in numbers. Another school of thought says that uh, the settled empires started to try to expand into the steppe, and so the steppe people banded together in larger formations in order to protect themselves from either the Chinese emperor or the Shah of Iran. So I don't think that debate is resolvable at 3,000 years distance. But it's interesting to see why the nomads were so good at state formation. So if you're raising livestock in the steppe, think about the American West. Think about how violent it was and how often people would rustle cattle or raid a settlement and steal everything. So you had to bind together with your neighbors. You had to create a political entity of some scale just to make sure that you could raise your livestock in peace. Because there are no walls, there's no wires, there's nothing protecting you from your neighbor. So I feel like um, we had a process in the steppe similar to the process in the American West, where people got together and organized themselves. Uh, it's logical. It's very different from farmers because in the case of farmers, the farmers are bound to the land. You can't steal the land. The only thing you can do is you can come to the farmers and say, give me some of your crop, but you have to leave the farmers with enough crop to eat and to plant the next year. So the basis of agricultural state formation is quite different from that of the nomadic state formation. The nomadic state formation is bottoms up. It's people getting together and organizing into larger and larger entities. In the agricultural, it tends to be top down. Someone comes and says, I will protect you, farmers, but you have to give me a share of the crop. So this capability of the horse breeding peoples to agglomerate into larger and larger political formations is a very flexible, very powerful tool. It enables them to come together to agree on how they're going to be organized, who's going to be their leader, what territory they're going to protect, and who's going to be the enemy. And I think this motor, this mechanism for creating a large entity is a really unique characteristic of the horse breeding people and all of the steppe empires from the times of the Scythians in the around 800, 900 BC, all the way down to the the Manchu peoples storming into China in the 1640s. It's all based on this ability of horse breeding peoples to organize themselves into large political entities.
Hmm. And tell us a little bit more about, the Scythians come up quite a bit in the book.
Sure.
And so tell us more about that culture and society.
Okay. The Scythians are really a fascinating people. They exert a sort of magic on our imagination because they left so many beautiful gold artifacts and other metals. And the first time I came into contact with them was in 1977. The Metropolitan Museum in New York had an exhibit that came from the Soviet Union called uh, the Scythian Gold, and we were just mesmerized by the form, by the colors. They were very powerful artisans. I remember these two ladies from Queens looking at this huge gold necklace, and one says to the other, "Oh, Sylvie, that would look great on you." I think we're just all of us wish we were Scythian kings and queens when we see this stuff. So they were a people most likely speaking a language related to modern Persian. Actually, the closest relative of the Scythian language is a small population in China called the Yagnubians. They speak the modern descendant form of Scythian. Um, and they occupied the original territory of the horse breeders. I don't think that means necessarily that they're the direct descendants of the original horse breeders. It just means that they their pasture ground coincide with where we find some very early evidence of horse breeding.
And where would
Uh,
that be?
Somewhere sort of north of the Black Sea until north of the Caspian Sea. Now, there's a lot of debate, and I got even articles about this today in my feed. There's a lot of debate as to what was the genetic background of the Scythians. There's some people argue that they had a lot of East Asian um, genes, and other people say no, they're Iranic people, so they would be similar to modern Iranians, uh, or they'd be a mix. So now we're doing a lot of investigation of human remains found in Scythian burials and trying to determine what are they really. But you have to keep in mind that because they had horses and because they had very big mobility, they roamed from uh, the mouth of the Danube in Romania to Mongolia. So it wouldn't be surprise me that their genetic makeup was a lot more cosmopolitan than we might imagine. Um, Nevertheless, from their names, their personal names, which are recorded, we are pretty convinced that they spoke a language in the Iranian linguistic family group. And there's also a lot of scholarly debate about how organized they were into an empire. There's a writer named Christopher Beckworth who wrote a book about 2 years ago, uh, a very big book, very strong argument, arguing that the Scythians had a very powerful empire and that they had a huge impact on China, India, and the West. Other scholars say the Scythians did not have a very formal political entity. They were more like a peoples with common customs and common rituals, so they could interact with one another. They could share. They could marry one another. But the Scythians living closer to the Pamirs and the Scythians living on the Danube would have had very little interaction with one another. That debate continues, but they were the first homogeneous steppe culture to emerge over this large period, and they influenced their succeeding nomadic empires significantly, particularly in terms of warfare, because they were the first people that we know to wear trousers for riding, to have saddles, soft saddles, not hard saddles, but they did have saddles, and to exercise firing the bow from the saddle. And so in terms of, let's say, the military technology that we associate with the nomadic empires, the Mongols and Manchus, wearing pants, riding in a saddle, firing a bow were fundamental building blocks for fairly effective military force projection.
Wow.
And
Yeah,
that's,
and
I think, the main legacy for the subsequent empires.
and throughout the book you see this this kind of it's not only like nostalgia but kind of fantasy and want of these horse breeds that are associated with different peoples and regions over time, and that kind of has its own evolution as well, and there's many
True.
different versions. But that was an interesting part of the book, and tell us a little bit more about some examples of that, how because really what one thing that I see in the book is and we can talk more about this, is how the this knowledge base of how to breed horses out on the steppe among these small groups of people. And sometimes they're small groups, sometimes they're larger groups, depending on what's happening politically and in terms of warfare. But this is the knowledge of how to breed in combination with the landscape for the horses to grow is something that all of the other civilizations like the Chinese are always fantasizing about. We need to go way over there because that's where the horses are bred in this certain way. And there's it's really, I mean, it's a super powerful kind of knowledge based economy that these early peoples had created for themselves. So let's kind of explore that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point to emphasize. Modern anthropologists, when they discuss horse breeding and horse husbandry with the nomadic people, they're always amazed about how much information these people have about their territory, about the plants, about sources of water, about seasonal variations in water. So, when your livelihood depends on it and you're in it for many generations, the base of knowledge you have to survive is just fabulous. And of course, in the early 20, well, I would say in the whole 20th century, foreign experts came in and tried to tell these people what to do, and it was a complete disaster, both in the Soviet Union and in Iran, and in Mongolia. It was just, there's no way that somebody who has not been receiving that knowledge from father to son, from mother to daughter, first generation, can um, can rebuild that knowledge base. So in terms of horse breeding, what did the knowledge base consist of? They knew very well how to identify a good horse at an early age. Think about ballet schools, and little girls, little boys come in, and the ballet instructor looks at them and said, "This 5-year-old will be a good dancer in 12 years." It seems impossible. How do you do that? But if you know, you know. So they would get foals, and they would look at the foals, and they would decide whether that foal would be a good horse for riding, or for breeding, or for milk. And they had a very rough and tumble approach to horse breeding. If the horse was not going to be a worthwhile horse, the foal, I mean, they would butcher that horse at age 2 or 3 and eat it, and that would be the end of that individual's gene line. If the horse looked like it had promise, they would raise it um, and potentially ride it. If they thought it was a really great horse, if it was a male horse, the colt, they would raise it for breeding. If they thought it was not a great horse, good enough to ride but not good enough to breed, they would geld the horse and then raise it as just as a riding horse. So in their herd, they would have, of course, the females for milk and for breeding. They'd have the geldings for riding, and they would have a very small number of stallions for breeding. And they would make all these decisions about the individual's survivability and breedability before the age of 2. And that's a real skill. Now, each of these horse breeding groups lived in different parts of the steppe. So as you mentioned, terroir was very important to them. The Mongols in Mongolia, where there were very rough winters, they had to breed rather hardy horses. They didn't want them to be too big because in good seasons you could feed a big horse, but since you always had the risk of a succession of bad winters, those horses would starve. So they were quite happy to have small, tough, shaggy shaggy horses with powerful, very strong hoofs, ability to negotiate pretty rough terrain. And that was for them a good horse. Whereas in Iran, where the winters are not as severe, and where food food is much more available than in Mongolia, they were able to raise much bigger horses, and so they would be selectively breeding for taller horses. And as a result, in much of the period that I cover in the book, Iranian horses were always renowned for being extremely tall and powerful, and they were coveted by both the Chinese and the Indian rulers, who often imported them by land or by sea. And of course, the Arabian horses, which are perhaps not really Arabian horses, but horses from the border between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, were coveted for other reasons.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. I didn't know until reading the book, but there's this hand measurement for height of a
Right.
horse. And over time, with certain, like the Chinese are looking for these taller and taller horses, and it's like all the descriptions are, how many hands,
Right.
height this horse
Right.
was.
Horse people measure horses by hands, and a hand is pretty. If you're dealing with the metric system, it's quite easy. A hand is about 10 centimeters. So if I say the horse is 15 hands high, it means it's 150 centimeters high. But sorry.
No worries.
There's two reasons, obviously, to have tall horses. One of them is just for prestige. If your horses are bigger than someone else's horses, because it's rather rare to have an extremely tall horse, you can congratulate yourself on having finer horses. But from a practical point of view, in battle, horses are a little bit like people insofar as you can psych them out by appearing bigger. And think about why in the old days, military people used to wear very high headgear. It's to appear taller. And a smaller horse, if confronted by a larger horse in battle, will often back away. So there was a premium in combat, horse combat, to have a taller horse. Now, and I guess, although I haven't experimented with this, but I guess having a taller horse also gives you an advantage in hand-to-hand combat.
Right. That would make sense. Yeah. And so it's interesting too, with one thing that for me was very counterintuitive is the evolution in terms of the chariot and then the war horse.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people, or I'm assuming most people for myself in this moment, but I would have assumed that you would have the war horse and then you would have the chariot. But in fact, it was kind of opposite. Can you kind of walk us through that historical evolution?
Sure. I was very surprised by that. I was completely surprised by that as well. You have to parse it down a little bit. So there's the debate is called the riding first or driving first. Were horses ridden before they were driven, or were they driven before they were ridden? So for the reason that I mentioned, you had to have some riding simply to herd the horses. Riding had to come first. But then what is riding? Is riding staying on top of a horse while the horse wanders around autonomously just to keep track of where the horses are? Is riding getting on a horse and riding it in the direction you want to go in for some period of time, staying on the back of a horse without a saddle? Is riding getting on top of a horse with weapons and maybe armor? And so you're adding about 50 kilo, 100 pounds of weight to your own body weight. So the earlier horses did not have the strength to do the last thing I mentioned. They were strong enough to have a light young person on their back, but not strong enough to carry an adult for several hours. Gradually, they bred horses to be stronger and stronger. There's an intermediate stage where the horses were strong enough to pull a chariot, but not strong enough for a warrior to sit on top of them. As I mentioned with milking, we've been milking domesticated mammals for a long time before we got the horse. Similarly, we had yoked animals to vehicles for a long time. I think I mentioned the ox was an animal for traction for several centuries before the horse. So we had carts and we had horses. Originally, the horses were too small to draw the carts, and the carts were too heavy to be drawn by horses. And we worked on both ends of the problem for a while. We managed to make carts which were lighter. We invented the hollow wheel with spokes to replace the solid wheels. We made the carts of lighter and lighter materials. We introduced metallurgy so that we could use metal rather than wood to strengthen the chassis, which made it lighter. And finally, we bred horses which were bigger and stronger. So at some point, the two technologies converged, the technology of the cart, the technology of the breed-selected horse, and we were in the chariot business. This probably then influenced the ability to ride the horse into battle, because as people learned how to drive a horse, they also learned more about how to control a big, powerful horse in battle. And eventually, we managed to take the horses out of the harness and ride it directly. But a lot of the technology for guiding a horse, the reins, the bits, the blinders, the martingale, all these elements which are used to control horses in combat were adapted for riding for cavalry. So cavalry emerged about 500-600 years after chariots did.
Right. And so yeah, that was just so counterintuitive to me. And because you have this big wave where like the chariot comes through, and if you're a chariot peoples, then you're just kind of decimating anyone that you're fighting at that time. And then you have, like you said, this kind of coevolution where not only are you evolving the chariot and then breeding the horse in terms of physical size, but there's also, I mean, the whole evolution is continually behavioral as well, right? Because the horse needs to be able to be in a war situation and stable, right? Like it's able to function and not throw. And I guess you kind of, you look back at movies now and it always seems dramatic, when the horse throws the guy off or, turns or does whatever it wants to do. But now I clearly see how that was probably just a very common thing, and you were breeding for that to not happen over time in terms of behavior. And then you move into cavalry, which really is kind of what seems to be really the final evolution, right? Until modern weaponry is developed. But up until that, then you have cavalry. So where are we in terms of like time frame with cavalry, and then how is that starting to interact? And I want to slowly move to, I mean, there's a couple of civilizations that are very fascinating in this story. The main one probably being, well, it's all interesting, but the Chinese, I think, and then you have the Indians, and then you also have kind of the Persians and that whole area. But I think the Chinese are of a particular focus. So let's just kind of play in that area for a bit of how that's changing.
So cavalry emerged around 800, 700 BC in the Middle East. The Assyrians, who had had a fairly big empire and then lost it, decided to get back into the game and rebuild the so-called Neo-Assyrian Empire. And at that point, they massively adopted cavalry. And if you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York or the British Museum in London or the Louvre in Paris, and you look at the Assyrian wall reliefs, you see cavalry. And that's the first instance of cavalry that we know about. The Chinese Empire, the first empire, the Qing Dynasty, and then the Han Dynasty, adopted cavalry about. Actually, I should say the rise of the Qing Empire, the first empire of China, was probably based on that state, on the Qin state's mastery of cavalry versus the other states of China, which were not as good at cavalry. And that may be because the Qin state was closest to the steppe, and maybe even the Qin dynasty itself was partly of steppe origin. So, the Chinese make a big distinction between the so-called conquest dynasties and local dynasties. And the conquest dynasties for them are these barbarians from Mongolia who come in and run China. But actually, the distinction is not so clear because many of the important dynasties of China may have originated in people who were sort of partly in the steppe and partly in the heartland of China, and the Qin are a good example of that. So the Qin had the biggest cavalry, the most professionally organized cavalry, and because they were adjacent to steppe, they could also find the best horses. They conquered China. The grave of the first emperor, I'm sure you visited in China, is full of these soldiers and full of these cavalrymen. And those cavalrymen, the terracotta army cavalrymen, show you exactly what the Qing cavalry looked like, which is quite amazing when you see it. And they look not that much different from cavalry that you would have, in the American Civil War and in the Spanish-American War, they looked like cavalry troopers. So that's when we see cavalry really emerging in China. And the problem for the Chinese emperors from then on was always to have a sufficient number of cavalry to defend China from invasion from the steppes. China had no risk of invasion from anywhere else. Until the 19th century, they were not being invaded from the sea. The Vietnamese were not invading them. The Koreans were not invading them. It was almost exclusively the Mongols and the Turks on their western frontier who represented a military threat to the empire, and therefore you had to have a very robust cavalry arm to protect the heartland of China.
And just really quickly, because the more that I study history, it's just so dynamic, right? I mean, everything we've talked about so far, it's like, well, these peoples were over here, but then, they can travel hundreds of miles within weeks. And so it's really hard to tell who was where, when, I mean, obviously we have some evidence in certain things, but when you say that, so the Chinese civilizations are trying to defend against the steppe, but when you say the steppe, really, we're talking about tens or hundreds of different separate kind of bands and groups of people that at some points in time they come together, sometimes they dissolve, they change. Earlier when you were talking just about like their ability to form these political alliances, but one thing you also take away from the book is how flexible those political alliances were. Right. So when you're talking about these early days with defending against the steppe, how many different, peoples are we talking about they have to defend against? Because it's sometimes they have alliances with some, but then they're being raided by another, and then it switches and changes.
It's very dynamic, and you're exactly right. It's that flexibility inherent in the way that the horse breeding people could organize themselves that made it very dynamic. And I think this challenged the Chinese themselves because they would have an interlocutor who would say, I'm the king of such and such, and I represent these tribes, and I'm making peace with you. And then the next day they'd be attacked by someone who might have, who they thought was a part of the tribe with whom they just made peace. And so the Chinese were very frustrated by, they said, well, these people are not really trustworthy. But what they didn't understand is the relationship between the individual tribesman and the chief was not perhaps as formalized as the relationship between the emperor and his subjects. And I think that was a big source of frustration for the Chinese, who obviously would have preferred diplomacy over warfare in order to stabilize their frontier. How many actual groups there are is very difficult to answer, partly because the Chinese themselves struggled to enumerate all the peoples. And I mean, in this respect, it's not that different from, let's say, the Roman writers about the Germans. They mentioned dozens of German tribes. We have no idea whether a word refers to more than one group of people, or whether several words refer to the same group of people. They didn't have anthropologists going out there and collecting kinship data, so they really were lost by the plethora of little groups who could combine, who could change names, who could sometimes take a name of an earlier group that had disappeared and then say, well, we're really those people. And so for the scholar in Rome, or the scholar in Xi'an, it was just a mystery to them, as it remains to us, because we don't have any evidence anymore.
I mean, I would have to say that was honestly, just as I've gone through this book, I was just like, dear God, I mean, how did he do this? You know, I mean, the fact that you were able to pull together so many different cultures, and not at just a generalized level, but to have the minute detail that you had about so many different I mean, it spans, you know, I mean, there's at least 50 to 100 different, you know, little pockets here of people, and then the larger civilization, and then how that transforms throughout history. I mean, it's extraordinary how you're able to pull it all together.
Justin, is very kind of you, but the fact of the matter is that I tried to spare the reader too much granularity, because I didn't think that the granularity adds to the story. So, for example, we talk about the Scythians, and I tried to use the word Scythian consistently for all the peoples with a kind of from a period of 800 BC to about 200 AD, who probably spoke in a language in the Iranian language family, and who were nomadic pastoralists. But in fact, if you read the Greek histories, Roman histories, there were dozens of names for these people, and we have no idea how one of those names succeeded the other. They're just names that pop up in the histories of the Greeks and the Romans, and I don't feel it adds anything to speculate as to why did the Romans call them this name now, in this century, in the following century they call them by another name, because their lifestyle was the same, their technology was the same, their culture was the same. It's a little bit like the names of political parties in the United States have changed all the time. Jefferson was a Republican. Right? That was the name of his party. So we get misled by the names. And so we should, let's say, abstract to a higher level, say what's really going on, and not get too caught up in the minutiae, as you say, of too much ethnological information, which we just don't have.
Right. And I think that was the brilliance of your writing, was a very delicate balance of how much granularity is needed, and then not, I mean, because you could have gone into, I mean, this book could be, you know, volumes if you were to get into every little minute thing about the different cultures coming through. And so I thought it was, you know, just the right amount for me, at least, and gave me a lot to you know, to further read and study. One of my favorite aspects and interesting phenomena to see in the book was this idea, though, of raiding and kind of facilitating sales through war, right? It seems to be a very old algorithm that still runs today. And I think a lot of people, there's an extraordinary bias toward modern culture today of, everything bad we see today wasn't happening before in a lot of ways. But it's very clear that there was purposeful raiding in order to get sales from some of these civilizations. So can you kind of walk us through that a little bit? Because I find that just super fascinating.
That's an interesting analogy you're making. I hadn't thought about that. So, horses produce, American produce 20 offspring in her lifetime, and since they come to sexual maturity after 3 or 4 years, one mare can produce. Let's say in the lifetime of a mare, she can have a lot of grandchildren, great grandchildren, great great grandchildren, and this population of horses in good climatic conditions just explodes relative to that of the people. So at some point, the horse breeders have too much of a good thing. They have too many horses for the pasture that they have. So what can they do about that? They can sell the horses. And of course, the Chinese Empire is a ready buyer of horses, and the Indians are happy to import horses. But sometimes there are more horses than the buyer wants to buy. And also the buyer would say, well, there's so many horses, so we're going to impose a very low price for the horse. We'll give you less than we gave you last year because you got too many horses to sell. So the horse breeder's option is to launch some strategic raids on the settled people, start a war, a small war, and this will lead to a greater demand for war horses on the side of the settled people, and they'll start buying more horses at a higher price. What's interesting is that one thing I don't talk about too much in the book is there's also obviously a slave trade going on, because one of the things that the horse breeders do is they raid and then they capture slaves and bring them back. So normally a horse is worth less than a slave, but in war the horse is worth more because you need them, and the price of slaves go down because there's so many of them. So it's really kind of a weird relationship between the slave trade and the horse trade, and both of them existed between the horse breeding peoples and the settled peoples. That's a sort of a sordid side of the whole exchange story here. So they did use warfare as a means of getting rid of the excess population of horses. Either the horses would die in war, but on the other hand, you would capture slaves or you would capture booty and enrich yourself. Or the settled state would buy more horses from you as a result of their loss of horses in the war, or even agree to a higher price for the horses because of the threat of war. And so it was a constant lever that you could use to improve the terms of trade between yourselves, the horse breeders, and the settled empires, the Chinese or the Indians.
Right. And yeah, it's super interesting, right? It's just simple economic logic of, well, I have excess supply. I need a way to stimulate demand. So,
That's
go
right.
raiding, stimulate either actual war or the fear of war. That way they start purchasing. And you see that happening over and over and over again, right? Throughout
Right.
the story that you tell. It's one of the most repetitive themes is that phenomena. Where do you think to go from here? I mean, I want to touch on India a little bit because
Mhm.
of the elephant. I thought that was quite fascinating. I also kind of want to touch on, I don't think, I mean, it was actually funny the other day in my notes. I literally did not have, Genghis Khan in my notes because there's so much other stuff going on in the book. It actually doesn't feel like it's the most important thing, but I do think, we should touch on that. And so we can go kind of to either of those.
Okay, well, if we want to talk about India, I can talk about Genghis Khan in that context. So The India's a huge place and as varied in terms of climate and terrain as Europe, for example. I mean, it is a subcontinent the way Europe is a subcontinent. There are a few places in India where horses can be bred, but for the most part, and particularly in northern India, the plains of the Ganges is not a good place for raising horses for the reason I mentioned earlier, which is that it's a really good place for agriculture. So in the trade-off of how to support your population, the Gangetic Plains has been a wonderful kind of cradle for civilization to grow because of its rich agriculture and less of a good place to graze horses. As a result, horses had to be imported from Afghanistan or over the Karakoram Pass eventually directly from Central Asia. The Indian rulers initially favored the elephant as a war, as a vehicle for war. They had chariots, of course, but a lot of India was covered by forest, and elephants, of course, are in their element in the forest. And the other thing about elephants that's very different from horses is the elephants eat several times their weight a day in trees, grass, bushes, leaves. So you really have to keep your elephants in the jungle in order to keep them fed. And if you look at the topography of India, then the horses are sort of in the north, in Afghanistan and in the Punjab, which in those days was rather barren. Northern India and northern Pakistan. The elephants are in the south, where there's dense forest cover and plenty of feed for them. So if you think about it, there's no reason for the elephants and the horses to ever really come into conflict with one another, unless you want to have a big empire that stretches all across all of India and up into Afghanistan. So successive Indian dynasties did try to expand empire from the sort of heartland in the Ganges Valley into Punjab and into Afghanistan. Probably they did this in order to fend off raids from the horse people who were based in Afghanistan. There's an Indian epic named the Raghuvamsa, which tells the story of an Indian hero who leads his army with elephants all the way to the Oxus River, which of course is the northern boundary of Afghanistan, the boundary today between Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. So we know that ancient India did have periodic attempts to conquer Afghanistan, which meant they had to master horses, because obviously you couldn't bring Indians over the Hindu Kush up to the Oxus River. So that's kind of the dynamic, and that dynamic, like you were saying about raiding and trading being a very persistent dynamic, that is a very persistent dynamic as well. Whoever rules India will want to control Afghanistan because it's a way of protecting India from invasion from horse-breeding peoples. And they realized that whereas the elephant might be a very good animal for waging war in the heavily forested parts of India, and they would be protected from cavalry attacks, once you get into the plains in northern India, you need horses to protect yourself. So ancient India had elephant chariots and cavalry, and over time, the chariot went out of fashion across the entire old world as a military vehicle, and the Indians continued to field armies with elephant and horses up until the 18th century. Yeah. Now, Genghis Khan. So the empire of Genghis Khan is basically a roll-up of all of the lands that were, in his generation, ruled by horse-breeding peoples. You think about him, he was like one of those drug cartels that just federated all the drug cartels and made sure that everything flowed into the center. he didn't really conquer too many places that were not already subject to horse breeding peoples. That's why the furthest east they went in Eastern Europe were places where already Turkish horse breeders had already been grazing. In Iran, he obviously invaded Iran and Iraq, but again, that had already been taken over by Turkish-speaking horse breeders a 100 years before. When he got to India, he immediately recognized that India was not a place that he needed to conquer or that he even wanted to conquer, because he could see that it was not a good land for horses. So he went into the Punjab, and he immediately recognized this was not for him, and he left. And I think that's the important part about understanding the empire of Genghis Khan. It was a roll-up of horse breeders, and he had no interest in conquering territories that were unfit for horses.
Mm-hmm.
Now, his great-grandson, his grandson or great-grandson, Kublai Khan, changed his mind, because Kublai Khan had been made governor of northern China, and he figured that if he could conquer China, which is obviously not a good place for raising horses, if he could conquer China, he might have an argument, because he'd be very wealthy if he conquered China, for being made the supreme Khan of the Mongols. And so he did something that no other Chinggisid prince had ever done. He conquered a major settled country that was not a good place for horses, made himself emperor of China, declared that he was he declared that there was a new dynasty, a Chinese dynasty called the Yuan, and that was such a prestigious position that the other Mongol Khan agreed to make him the supreme Khan. But it was a real change of operating modus, because suddenly he's just a settled emperor of China, and very soon he and his cousins in Mongolia had nothing in common anymore, and the Mongolians didn't want to trade with him, and they didn't want to pay taxes to him, and they reverted into this traditional relationship between Mongolia and China, whereby the Mongolians are raiding the Chinese, even though the Chinese are ruled by the Mongols.
And yeah, it's super fascinating. So just one note leading up to before that is you describe in the book how if there's one underlying narrative and social fabric that is easy for him to play off of, is that we're all horse breeding nomadic people, right? So that kind of makes it easier for him to come in and connect all these very disparate peoples all across the steppe like never before, which probably he was realizing in places like India is like, well, if you're not a horse people and you're not good for my main, way of waging war, and culturally, I won't be able to maybe do the same thing.
Right.
I thought that was interesting. But then let's talk about there's this idea of kind of as some of these Mongols start to rule in a settled way in China, there's this idea of softness that arises, that they, oh well, he doesn't know how to ride anymore, right? He's kind of soft and he's more Chinese than he is Mongol, and there's that kind of phenomena developing.
Right. The horse breeders always had a feeling that their lifestyle was superior to that of the settled people. The Turks had a saying, if you settle down, you smell your own shit.
Uh,
So there were, and one of the early Turkish Khans said, I leave you my testimony. Do not settle down. Do not give up your lifestyle. If we do that, we're lost as a people. So there was a very strong ethos to maintain the nomadic lifestyle. Even Kublai Khan, as I mentioned in the book, would spend the hot summer months in the mountains north of Beijing, and they would act as though they were back. They would live in tents. They would act as though they were back in the steppe. The emperor and his entourage would milk horses themselves. and drink fresh horse milk,
It's like going camping,
like
modern day
going camping.
camping.
But but and going hunting, by the way, which was a huge occupation for the Mongol Khans and subsequently for the Manchu emperors as well. But the basic problem was they didn't have a common economic dependency with the horse breeders in Mongolia. The horse breeders in Mongolia still had the problem of, I have too many horses, I need money for these horses, and they didn't get any advantage over the fact that their cousin was emperor in China. So eventually, they turned against him, and when the Han Chinese revolted against the Mongol dynasty, the Mongol dynasty was not able to use the horsepower of Mongolia to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm. Wow, very interesting. You've mentioned the Manchu people a couple times. I don't feel like I know too much. I was looking at the map the other day, and so that is what is the technical name of that area? Is it Mon?
Well, I mean, I think today the Chinese call it Heilong Guo. The Chinese have given that area a different name because they don't like the idea. They don't like the name Manchuria. It's associated with the puppet government established by the Japanese in World War II.
Okay, but this is an area that is like roughly kind of, is it like northeast of Beijing, kind
It's
of?
it's it's the area that's bounded by the Russian border in the north, by the Korean border in the east, and by the Mongolian border in the west. It's confusing. I wish I knew how you could call it generically, because the problem is that the word Manchuria comes from the people, the Manchus. The Manchus is a term invented by one of the Manchu rulers for people who were earlier called the Jurchens. So that makes a real mess of the place, because we say the Jurchen came from Mongolia, but in fact, the Jurchen came from Manchuria, but in fact, the name Manchuria didn't exist at the time of the Jurchen. But let's go back to just before Genghis Khan. At the beginning of the 11th century, China was ruled by a dynasty called the Qing Dynasty, meaning the Golden Dynasty, and they were Jurchen. They were ethnic Jurchens. They were horse breeding peoples from that area north and east of the Great Wall, who spoke a kind of Altaic language. I'm not really sure how to describe it. Maybe similar to Korean or similar to some of the languages in very northeast corner of Asia. And they managed to conquer northern China in the generations before Genghis Khan. They murdered Genghis Khan's father. There was therefore a blood feud between Genghis Khan and the Jurchen. So the first thing Genghis Khan wanted to do when he came to power was to take out the Jurchens, which he managed to do, and replace the Jurchens in northern China. After that, the Jurchens had a low profile for about 300 years, and then they come back on the historical scene. They replicate their success in creating a strong state on the northern border of China. And then when China collapses in a civil war at the end of the Ming Dynasty, the Khan of the Jurchens pops into Beijing and proclaims himself emperor of the Chinese, and he named his people the Manchus. And we're not really sure what that name meant for him. But henceforth, the people are the Manchus, and the dynasty is the Bright Dynasty, the Pure Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, which lasted until 1912.
Oh, so that's like the last
Imperial dynasty.
The last one. And is that the Qin?
Qing?
Qing, okay. And right, so they were the ones who eventually had to deal with like the British and the French coming over.
Yeah. And I tried to point out in the book that we think of them as losers because they lost the Opium Wars against the British and the French. But the way I look at it is they They won a huge number of wars on the steppe border. They made China bigger than it had ever been before. They saw off the Russians, who would have been very interested in taking over what is today Western China. And so, if they lost a few battles to the British and the French on the coast, their attitude was, well, that's a seaborne invasion. Those people are pirates. They'll be gone eventually. And they were right. In 1945, they were gone. Whereas they managed to preserve their empire on the Western frontier to this day.
Right. Yeah, it's very fascinating the way you describe that, of kind of how it's, if you have a choice between defending the steppe and defending the seaside, they clearly chose the steppe, for multiple reasons. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously now they have lots of sea control, and they've expanded on that side, but also just knowing the amount of, I mean, just the sheer number of mineral deposits that China has now that could potentially have been Russian or someone else, but in modern times they're Chinese because they maintained that steppe area, hundreds of years ago, which is very fascinating.
That's partly why the Chinese have currently have a very high opinion of the great Qing Emperor, Qianlong Emperor, because he really put his weight behind preserving the western border, making sure that the horse breeding people were completely pacified. He did that with a combination of diplomacy and brutality, but he brought peace on the steppe frontier for the first time in 2,000 years of Chinese history.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let me ask you this question, and it's a sensitive question, but one cannot help but I think ask it because I think it's important in today's day and age. But just watching the back and forth of warfare and trade, economics, raiding, all of the things together. Why is it, do you think, that we think of colonialism as like it's like this very short time span nowadays, with how people think of it as only being a British, American, Spanish phenomena that was like this very short time, and we need to make up for all of that in modern times in different things. Whereas, I mean, it's what would, do you view any of the old time things that you wrote about as being extremely different than colonialism, or would you say that the fundamentals are the same?
Well, so I think the fundamental behind that are the same, but the colonialism is a little bit different at the way it was experienced both by the colonialists and by the colonized, because it happened so fast and with so little pre-existing historical relationships. So the ebb and flow of winners and losers in the steppe went back and forth over 3,000 years with a lot of persistence. Chinese had a very clear idea of who the people were at a high level in Mongolia and in what is now Western China. The Iranians had a very clear idea of who these people were on the other side of the Oxus. So when they invaded, sure, there were subjects and there were rulers, but there was a sense of, well, this has happened before, and this can happen again, and maybe we'll come out from under this. But everyone was sort of there was no psychological trauma from the fact that these people were there, whereas Western colonialism started with the technological revolution of these incredible seagoing vessels. And suddenly these people show up from Spain and they rule your country, and you have no idea who they are, and you think they're gods, or you think it's an apocalypse. And I think the psychological trauma of that. I mean, you're in Peru right now, right? So you know exactly how it must have been when the Spanish showed up. There was no prior history between those people, and the Spanish didn't understand anything about the Incans, right? So the at a psychological, cultural, level, it must have been terrible in a way that the horse people's invasion of China or Iran was not. For all the
Mm,
brutality of the Mongols, people sort of knew what they were, where they came from, and what was going
right.
on.
It's an interesting way to view it, right? Of the fact that yeah, the fact that I've been traumatized by you before, or I've traumatized, that we have a consistent relationship of
Right,
traumatization versus a completely new, unexpected, like, whoa, where did this come from type of experience is kind of how you're describing it. But I mean, I can't help but feel that, like, it wouldn't be, you know, no matter where you are in the world, when someone shows up and takes your wife and daughter, one day of how intense of an experience that would be. But it's just curious because it does feel like the majority of the sentiment in modern times is not really. I think there's a lot of denial of prehistory. I think we have a lot of illusion and fantasy about prehistory these days. And that, but really, you even started with this, which was, I mean, the big change was technology, right? Was the ship and the well, not then, but the seafaring cultures of the modern, or colonial Spanish and
right,
French. That was the big differentiator, and maritime knowledge and ability to go farther than ever before that enabled that whole thing. Whereas this was all premised on everyone has horses and we're moving, and this whole thing is morphing,
right.
constantly. It's very fascinating though to see the difference between the horse and the ship in that aspect.
Sure.
Um, wow, yeah,
So we never talked about the Silk Road.
yeah, yeah, that's right. I was remembering that a minute ago. Let's do that real quick.
Real quick. So we talked about raiding and trading and how that's kind of a fundamental and persistent relationship between the steppe and the settled countries, China, India, point west. And because the empires in India, the Chinese Empire, had to buy horses on a massive scale, as I point out in the book, the Indians, for example, under the Mughal rulers, India had to import about 100,000 horses a year in order to maintain a cavalry of 700,000. Uh, that meant for a huge business opportunity for horse breeders in Central Asia. And they supplied horses. What's surprising is that they supplied horses from Central Asia all the way to China, all the way to India. And in fact, Indian buyers and Chinese buyers competed for those horses, and the price went up because of the competition between those two big land settled states to buy horses. So this was clearly a huge business for those times. It goes back to the early attempts of the Chinese to acquire enough horses for their cavalry, and that was clearly the most important commodity, as you said in the beginning of the program, that was going across the Silk Road. Silk itself, um, most of the silk that was imported into Europe, for example, came by sea. Uh, most of the luxury commodities we're talking about came by sea. Why is that? Because it's very lengthy to bring commodities across the Silk Road. It takes 2 years to get from China to the Mediterranean. It's expensive. Uh, you can't bring that much, and it's dangerous. Horses, on the other hand, travel as kind of an army. They feed themselves on the way, so they don't cost you anything. There's pretty much no time value of money involved because you're raising these horses yourself. And so it's a very lucrative business simply to raise horses on a very large scale and then sell them to the Chinese or to the Indians. It just doesn't make sense to put silk and camels in China and drive those camels all the way to the Mediterranean and sell them to the Europeans. Um, but it does make sense to put them in ships because you can bring a huge number of silk swaves via ship that you could never bring via camel. And meanwhile, you have to feed those camels all the way. And then when you get to Rome, what do? You take the empty camels and send them back. It's just not a model that makes sense. And indeed, we don't find Roman coins in China. So Chinese didn't buy, the Romans didn't buy things from the Chinese. The whole story about this road from China to the West being built on trade in silk just doesn't hold up. But on the other hand, it's very clear that for centuries, the horse was the biggest commodity of trade between the steppe and the peripheral countries.
Right. And then I've read before that the silk was used, oftentimes it was actually used as currency, right? In a
Right.
very specific dimension, size, and that way you knew how much it was potentially worth. And that's another fascinating part about the story that you show, and even you can see how it makes sense with, the Chinese at one point adopt this strategy of, hey, let's give them all these gifts, let's kind of soften them up, let's make them fat and happy, and that'll maybe pacify them in these ways, right? But then what you see happening is, and this is where I think again, we have to be very careful with how we analyze things, but it's like, you could look at the steppe peoples and be like, oh, they're very into gifting, and they would take the gift they got from the Chinese and then gift it to someone else. But really, all of that gifting is strategic politics masked along the
Yeah.
way, right? It's a continual keep giving it down the line. That way, when I need to call upon the group of people over here with X many horses that I'm going to need for this big raid I'm putting together, they're going to come along with me. And it's all this jostling for political position over time, which I thought was super fascinating as well, and the flow of goods from China to the steppe.
Yeah, no, we definitely find a lot of silk in archaeological sites along the Silk Road. But like you say, it was silk as money that was used to pay for the horses, or it was silk as luxury gifts that were used to in diplomacy between China and the steppe peoples. And then, as you said, the steppe peoples passed those luxury items sort of from hand to hand to hand in order to build bigger relationships and cement their political
Right. In
control.
order in order to secure horsepower for the raid to go do the whole thing again. And so
That's logic.
the entire logic, the entire phenomena revolves around the horse.
That's correct.
That's the fascinating part about this. And yeah, I just feel super lucky that I happen to be walking through, living in Peru. I don't get to walk into like a Barnes and Noble. And so that only happens for me like once a year if I'm back in the States. So I think I was actually in a Barnes and Noble in Reno, Nevada. And that's where I saw the book. And I wanted to ask you this. It seems to be another prominent book on the history of the horse out around the same time right now.
Yeah.
I've seen it in another. I mean, that to me is not, it's like two versions of Sapiens coming out at the same time.
Actually, there are
It,
three. There are
there's three.
three. So there is a book by Taylor, who is who's an anthropologist, or excuse me, an archaeologist. And Taylor, and I cite Taylor pretty extensively in the earlier part to my book because, of course, he published a lot of papers before he, pulled it all together into a book. And I recommend that book, which I think is called Hoofbeats, for people who are really interested in the archaeological side and want to understand how we found from these horse fossils, how did we reconstruct the whole history of the genus. And he's very good for that. And he personally participated in many of these digs. And he's very good at explaining the DNA and the means for extracting ancient DNA and so forth. So I really enjoyed that book, and of course I learned a lot from him in his previous publications. And then there's a book by Weinberg called The Horse. which covers a lot of the territory I cover. He wants to cover the horse globally, so he talks a lot about Australia and South America, which I don't talk about at all. But for me, that book is more like Kenneth Clark's Civilization Plus Horses, because it's a very broad survey of
Mhm.
human civilization as a whole, and where the horse fits in. Whereas I'm more trying to tell the story of how a particular civilization evolved only around horses. So it's not really the same book, but there's a lot to be learned from it, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, I thought that was fun. I mean, just the amount of times that I had to open up a map or Google Maps to look at the regions and try and, some of the rivers you were mentioning. It's a great way into so many aspects of history or cultures that you've never heard of and peoples you've never heard of. And I'm imagining, is there any I mean, there's a lot of characters that come up throughout time. I mean, I think one of them was like the Chinese. I don't know if he was the general or what, but he was the one who was like, "We're gonna go way across over here," and he had to have all of that food supplied, and it was like an impossible feat. Is there any character besides the traditional big ones known like Genghis and things like that that you feel could warrant an entire, book or story on in the future?
Yeah. Let's see. I I'm intrigued by this Mughal general named Firuz Jang. He's the guy who says that horses are the basis of empire, and when you don't have horses, you don't have an empire. But he's quite. There's a lot known about him, but very little. There's no English language biography of him. He was quite a ferocious guy, and today in India, he would be considered a bad guy because he killed a lot of people. And of course, today the Indians are trying to argue that the only bad people in India are the Mughals, and everyone else was
Mm,
great before the Mughals showed up. Um, Firuz Jang was a scholar. He was a scholar of Sanskrit as well as Persian. He wrote definitive manuals on how to raise horses. He was a successful general. He was involved in some of the great Mughal conquests. He was a courtier. He was sort of an all around genius. And I would like to learn more about him when I have time.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was like, well, I hope David writes another book because like there's some as I'm reading and I'm wondering because obviously a lot of these characters there's probably not a lot of material available on them. Even like you said for this guy, there's nothing available in English. But for some of them, I'm imagining that even just in general information, regardless of language, there's probably not a lot available all the time for some of these characters.
You'd be surprised at how much is available, because if I was able to find out enough about them, I guarantee you, I only saw
Touch
the
the
tip of the iceberg in
Okay.
terms of Chinese historical material, in terms of Persian historical material. We really underestimate how much is locked away in libraries in Iran, in Turkey, in China. Uh, how much is available in manuscript? Some of those they're not published, they're not printed. There
Mm,
is a huge amount of material, and we're only beginning to see the beginning
wow.
of historiography in this part of the world.
That's interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of Netflix shows and documentaries and books to be seen, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
that's an interesting part. How long did it take you to write the book?
50 years.
50 years. Okay.
Well, as I said, I went to Afghanistan in 1975 and went horseback uh, traveling, and that gave me some sense of the lay of the land and the ecology of horses and the relationship between the horse breeders and horses. And I read just about every book on that topic for the next 50 years. And then starting in 2020, I started reading extensively in the um, academic literature. So not books, but scientific articles, 2, 3, 4,000 scientific articles on every aspect of the story. For example, you may recall that I was surprised that ancient authors spent so much time talking about the whorls, which is the patterned on horses' coats. And I wondered why that was. And I found out there's a whole um, literature on horse whorls and laterality, which means whether horses are left-handed or right-handed. Who knew, right? I mean, until you get into it, you don't realize that there's a lot of smart people out there studying very narrow topics. But when you put all those narrow topics together, you get a much broader, deeper picture of the horse or whatever theme you're studying than you would have by just sort of reading books of general knowledge. So that took me about 2 years to do. And then I wrote the book in 21 and 22.
Okay. So when you finally started writing, about 2 years to actually put it all together
Yeah.
and do
two
that.
years of research, 2 years of writing.
Wow. Must have been a good time, huh?
Well, actually, the worst part of it was um, writing footnotes. I think everyone agrees that writing footnotes is very painful. But in my case, it was particularly painful because I had I think I have probably I have 30 pages of footnotes, so probably 400 footnotes. But there were some points in the book where I could not find the original citation, and it was driving me crazy. I had about 12 orphaned footnotes for which I could not find the source. And I spent about 6 months trying to track them down. I went back to the libraries where I had been. I got the books out again. I looked at the books. And I think I got 12 down to 8, and then 4 of them I just had to say bye-bye. I'm not going to be able to footnote that. So either I took the point out of the book or I simply left it with no reference.
Wow.
But
Yeah.
it's very, very difficult. My advice to anyone who's not trained as an academic scholar, because obviously they know how to do this, but my advice to anyone else is do not write things down in small notebooks. Type everything.
Yeah, keep it nowadays in a Google Doc where you can
Exactly.
search it in a way. Yeah, for
Exactly.
sure.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
I'm doing I'm doing a lot of writing these days, and I'm noticing I have a propensity to go, and I prefer not even notebooks, but I prefer just blank
Oh,
computer
that's
paper,
killer.
and but over time, if I don't type those and get them into a document, then there's a huge risk of losing things and all sorts of stuff,
That's right. That's right. Digitalization is your friend.
Yeah, exactly. You own any horses?
No, I owned the horses that we rode in Afghanistan, and I belonged to a couple of clubs where we had horses, but I am now at an age where I think it's better to stay on my own 2 feet.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Even at my age, it's interesting you brought up the whirls a minute ago because it was just really fun. Like the energy of the horse was coming into my world for some reason the past several months. I have a friend here in Peru, and she has two rescue horses, and it's the first time that I really spent some time around horses besides childhood. And she mentioned one day she was showing me the whirl on the female and the whirl on the male, and she was talking about there's behavioral differences that people will read into, and like you were describing, there's a whole horse psychology and literature on the whirls and the type of things that they display, which was interesting. But then I found your book like a month and a half. I'd had this extraordinary experience with this mare, who's been deeply traumatized, and we had to move them from one place to another a couple of miles, but we had to walk them. And there's lots of when walking here where we live. I mean, we're in the mountain valley, and so there's lots of just big, there's rocks it's rock roads, and then there'll be a little creek and small bridges, and she would refuse to walk over certain things. And even at one point, the stream, it's like an inch deep. She would refuse, and so I'd
Sure.
have to stand there with her for 15, 20, 30 minutes at a time, trying to convince her energetically that, hey, we're going to be okay, it's safe, you can trust me, and let's go, let's move forward. But it was hours, because of the amount of times we would stop because she wouldn't want to move forward. And so it was really unique, I think, to have spent those hours with the horses, and then just like a month and a half later stumble upon your work. And it was all just a lot more fun, because it was, slightly more tangible in a way,
Life
experientially.
life is great like that. I find that very often that I will have an experience, and then later on, just randomly, I'll read something that's so pertinent to that experience, and you say, "Wow, if I hadn't had that experience, I wouldn't really be able to relate to this."
Yeah, totally. And so I feel like, yeah, your work was super relatable in that way. And for anyone listening to this, I mean, if you're interested in ancient history, in human evolution, in horses, and just human culture, this is a fantastic read. Honestly, it's one of the most fun books that I've read in a very long time.
Oh.
So, yeah. Well, thanks again, David. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. It's been fantastic.
Justin, thank you. I'm really happy to meet you and to have met such a deep reader of the book. I mean, your reading is really impressive, and that's what authors want to hear.
Well, I'm glad I could provide that. And so, yeah, David Chaffetz, the book again, I'll put right here, is Raiders, Rulers, and Traders, and it is the horse and the rise of empires, and there's no doubt about that. So, all right, I'm gonna turn this off.